So I'm going to start with a question this morning, and that's if you are joining online, you are also welcome to answer this in the comments down there. I'll see it because I get to see all the little things up here on my handy dandy little tablet. So my question to you all this morning, as we get started, is when do you worry? Is it when you're in certain places or doing a certain task? Is it always around a certain group of people, like family or friends or coworkers, or around Chiefs fans because it's that time of year? Is it when you're in an unfamiliar setting? When do you worry? Any takers on there?
At night when you can't sleep.
At night when you can't sleep. There's a good one.
When kids go away to college.
When kids go away to college. Not that you've got any experience coming up with that at all. Any other times when you worry? And there's some good ones in there, and I know y'all are probably thinking of some more. And so the good responses there. Now, here's my next question, though. How many of you, when I ask the question, when do you worry, immediately translated that in your head as, what do I worry about? That's the question we get asked most of the time, isn't it? What are you worried about? Now, that's a very different list, isn't it? Like, I want to talk about what I'm worried about. That can be a very giant list of things that I worry about, or sometimes don't we if we don't want to answer the question, or we aren't sure, we give kind of those vague answers of, well, I worry about stuff, things, I worry. For anyone who's listening on the radio next week, I just vaguely gestured with my hands out into whatever is out there. We do this, right? Sometimes if we're asked what we worry about, we aren't sure, and so we kind of do this, and we either aren't well know, or sometimes we can be overwhelmed by just the sheer number of them. There's a big difference between those two questions. I would say that when you worry, and that there's something that we can normally do something about, even if we aren't sure what it is that we're worrying about. We can still give some fairly vague answers, like when that's the trouble with asking what do you worry about, is we can give some vague answers, we aren't going to be real specific. Eventually we can drill down to the what in there, but it might take some more time and more effort. But we say when, even if we give a vague sort of answer like, when I can't go to sleep at night, when I'm at home, when I'm driving down the road, when I'm on an airplane, we can say those things. When we ask when, we're beginning to name some things. Even if we're being kind of vague, we're still naming something in there, saying I'm worrying at this time when I'm doing this thing, and that can be, and that is good. That's a good place to be. Often asking questions in a different way gets us a different answer. Helps us to understand things in a different way. We ask, what do we worry about? That leads us to one set of answers. But we ask, when do we worry? That leads us to something different. I like asking when. Because then we don't even have to completely understand ourselves and what it is we might be worrying about. We can just know that I know that in this set of circumstances, I'm going to start worrying here. I may not even know what. And if you're really good, you're going to get pre-anxiety about the future worries that you're going to have, because that's kind of what we do sometimes, isn't it? We find ourselves in those places. But when we can know when, we can be better prepared, and we might be able to cope with things far better in those moments when we know when we might be worrying. That's a good first step. That's the first step that Jesus is helping Peter and the disciples to make out of our story for this morning. He helps them do this even before, he is already counteracting this before they get started into the middle of the important part of this story. Jesus says to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." So we start there. In fact, let's go back and let's take a look at this story again. And look at when Peter worries. The story starts with Jesus teaching a crowd of people. In fact, this isn't just any crowd that he has taught. This is one of those very large crowds in Matthew's gospel where he has fed them also from a very small amount of food. This comes right after that. Jesus has just fed them really well. Everyone is full and they're happy. And as Jesus is winding down, he tells his disciples, go ahead, hop in the boat and head out across the lake. I'll catch up with you later. I'm going to dismiss the crowd and then I'm going to go up onto the mountain to pray. This is what Jesus does in Matthew's gospel when he needs time to himself, when he needs time to go pray. He goes up onto a mountain. And the folks who would have been listening to Matthew's gospel the first time, who would have been primarily a Jewish or at least a Jewish familiar audience, would have said, oh, well, of course, all holy things happen on mountains. So, of course, Jesus is going to go up on a mountain to pray. And so the disciples head off. Jesus dismisses the crowd, and he goes up onto the mountain and prays. Now, we get a little bit of a scene change in there, and we come to the disciples on the boat out in the middle of the lake. And there's a storm coming up, the waves are going, it's not someplace where I would like to be in the middle of a boat on a storm, quite like that, with no life jackets anywhere to be seen. But these guys were fishermen. They'd done this 1,000 times before. This wasn't the moment when they were afraid that they were going to sink in the boat and Jesus calms the storm. We're given no indication here in this moment that they are worried at all. It's just another storm. They know how to handle this. But that makes it all the more important than when the next part of this happens, because as they're in there and they're watching this storm and they're kind of navigating their boat through this, they see something off in the distance. Now they're starting to worry, because here's this thing from a place where they aren't expecting it to be, where there probably shouldn't be anything, and it looks like it's moving closer. Hollywood has made a lot of money off of movies that start this way. Like this, so they are starting to worry. Now they are worried because there are things they don't understand that are going on. When are they afraid? They're afraid when something unknown comes to them from a place where it shouldn't be, and in a place that they know well. Then they worry. But as this unknown thing gets closer, they begin to see it and recognize it, and they see it as Jesus. And his first words to them in this moment are, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Now this would make a good story already, but we aren't done here. Peter is still skeptical, and I haven't decided yet in this part of the story if Peter is the bravest man ever or the dumbest man ever. I think he's probably both. But he looks out there. Jesus says it's me, and they're all kind of like, okay. Peter says, all right, Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come out there and join you. Now, if it's not him, and he says, come on out here, what's going to happen to Peter in the middle of the storm on the lake? That's why I can't decide if he's incredibly brave or incredibly stupid here. But Jesus just looks at him and says, all right, come on out. And so Peter steps out of the boat onto the water. Now, nothing has changed so far for what Peter is experiencing except his location. Now, instead of being inside of the boat, he is outside of the boat, and he is walking on the water, and things are good until he gets distracted. He sees the wind. I mean, you don't really see wind, but he can see the impact of the wind on the waves around him, and he can see this thing coming up, and he's beginning to get afraid. Now he's worried about what's going to happen, and of course, it's at this moment that he begins to sink down into the water. And this is where Jesus looks over at him, asks him why he doubted, pulls him back up, and they both climb back into the boat. And as soon as they get back into the boat, the storm calms down. Why did you doubt? Why did you worry? What were you worried about? All would have been the way we would have asked that question normally. And Peter could have responded in lots of different ways. Well, I was worried about things and stuff, because I'd imagine he's still probably a little bit shaky after that experience. But what if we asked Peter instead in this moment, we asked him a different question. He said, Peter, when were you afraid in this moment? Well, at that point, you might give the obvious answers. When I left the boat. When I stepped out on the water. When I saw how big the waves were. That's when I was worried. I was worried a lot about those things. And that's then when we can ask those next We can go back to what questions after that, because now we can name something and say, what were you worried about when you stepped out? What worried you when you saw the wind? What were the worries that Peter was having? Peter was leaving the things that he knew well. Peter knew how to handle a storm, handle being in the middle of the storm on a lake in a boat. Peter could handle that. He knew how to deal with that. He'd done that a lot. That's why the story when Jesus calms the waves, you have to think about just how worried they were that they went to wake Jesus up, because these were guys that were used to this kind of thing. It's like when you're watching Deadliest Catch. You know, the guys in those boats, they don't get worried about a lot, but when they start to get worried, you know the storm is bad. Peter was no longer in a place that he knew. He was no longer in the comfort and the safety of the boat that he was used to being in, and he's seeing around him all these sorts of things that he know aren't good. Because at this point in his career, he has probably known boats that have sank, boats that have capsized. He's probably known folks even who have died while fishing in rough waters, or who got caught out in a storm. He knows the dangers. And now he's not in the one place of safety that he knows he can be in. And so Jesus' response to him is, take courage. It is I, don't be afraid. I like Peter a lot. Peter often, when we read the gospel stories, often stands in for us, stands in for the other disciples. He stands in for that little voice in the back of our heads that we all filter out because we've learned how to act in polite society. Peter doesn't have that filter installed, and so he will ask all of the things. And he'll say all of the things. And I feel like Peter a lot of times. When do I worry? We all have lists of things that we worry about. We all have lists of the what we worry about. But more often than not, all of those whats can begin to feel a little overwhelming. Until we stop and we think, we can probably group these things together a little bit. We start with the question, when do we worry? Identify those places, and then put all of those whats into those places when we worry. That becomes a much smaller list. And we've got lots of stuff that we worry about, but we only worry about them in maybe a handful of places. That's an easier list to deal with. For me, when I worry is when I'm in situations where they are either outside of my control or that I don't understand. Those are the places where I worry. That's when I worry. And pretty much everything that I worry about can be put into one of those three places. What I don't understand, things that are outside of my control, or the worst one, things that I don't understand and are outside of my control. Like those are when I worry the most. Now the first step in handling our worry is not to try and get control of the situation. Like that's what we're told. Like, well, you got to get control of the situation. That actually is not the right place to start. The first place to start is that works best. At least this works best for me. Stop, catch my breath, acknowledge that it's there. Name that. Hey, I am in a place where I am worrying right now. But then know that it doesn't have to have control over me. This is Jesus' response to Peter. Even before Peter steps out onto the water, Jesus is already telling him how to handle this. Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. What I like about what Jesus is doing here is that he's not giving us a final answer. That in fact what he's giving us here is the first response. So often if we know folks that are really worried about things and they're anxious about whatever it is that's going on, we say, hey, you know what? It's okay, just kind of calm down, catch your breath, and you'll be fine, and you can get through this, and then we can go on with things, right? And that's like saying to a little kid who's in the middle of a temper tantrum, if you just chill out, things would be okay, right? When in the history of ever has telling a little kid who's having a temper tantrum to chill out worked? It didn't work for us very well either, does it? But it's a good first step. Because what are you going to follow it up with? And this is where Jesus' response is the first step. This isn't an end point where he says, just take courage, I'm here, it's all going to be good from now. Jesus is saying, whether we're in the NIV, the NRSV, the CEB, the King James, it all comes down to either take courage, take heart, or take encouragement. Different ways they translate that, but it's all saying, Remember who is the one that has control in this moment. It's not your worry or your anxiety or what you're dealing with. Remember what happened to Peter when he let those things have control. He steps off of the boat into the water. He's good for a moment because he's keeping his focus in the right place. It's when he begins to see the things around him that he's like, that's when he begins to sink down into the water. When I find myself in those places, and Emily says that, looks at me and says, you're spiraling, because that's what I end up doing. I have to stop. And when I'm doing this well, which isn't very often because I'm still working on this, I have to stop and then I have to remember what it is that I'm focused on. Now, it's really easy to do when I'm standing up in front of the sanctuary because I can look back and there is literally a picture of Jesus holding a lamb with a shepherd's crook in his arm on a window almost as big as me in the back. Easier to do here, harder to do on my own, but that's the first spot. Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. That's step one. Jesus spends the rest of the Gospels, doing step two. How do we overcome this? 90% of the time, when we stop, we catch our breath, we take stock of where we are, we remember that these things don't control us, but that we follow the one who has control over us. We realize that we already know how to handle these situations. And that's a huge thing to remember. Is that we've lived life for a very long time. We know how to handle this, but sometimes that worry wants to get control of us, especially in those places where we are prone to worry. They want to have control over us. When we remember that those aren't the things that are in control, we take stock of where we are, we remember, we know how to deal with this. The second part of that, though, is for those times when that's not the case, Jesus does with us what he does with his disciples. He says, all right, you've got step one done. Now we're going to work on step two. Step two is going to be figuring out now where do we go from here, but it's always we, because he always goes with us to make that happen. Whether it's bringing us together in groups of folks that are experiencing different things, or just bringing us together or putting us in a different place so that we can see what needs to be done, or just bringing us together with folks that will help us and support us in whatever way is needed. This is what Jesus does. This is what he does with his disciples. He wasn't going to get them to work through all this one-on-one all the time. He brought them together in a group. He said, as a group, you guys can figure this out, and you're going to be fine, and you'll get through this. Just follow where I'm leading. And he does the same for us. We live in a time when we worry about a lot of things. It doesn't take very long before you can turn on the news or turn on Facebook or wherever it is that you're looking at, and your blood pressure can go up really high very quickly. That's the time we live in. We have lots of things we can worry about, but instead of focusing on those things, first focus on where we're headed and on who we're following. And when we start to take steps into those worries, we remember that. The rest of it we can work out. We've been working it out for a couple thousand years. I think we can work through the next, next month or a couple months or a year or 2 years or 5 years, whatever it is. We will get through it because we're following the one who has already led us through. Let us be a people that can take that message with us, not just for ourselves, but for a world that needs to hear it. And to remember, Jesus says, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Let us do this in his name. Amen.